Yeah, so you were explaining. So we're recording right now. We're going live.
Sure.
And we're diving in right away. I love it.
Absolutely.
We're already hitting on so many good topics. But we're sipping chocolate. We're getting in the zone.
Exactly.
the chocolate zone. And I think to start, because you are the chocolate guru, um, I would love to dive into your world of chocolate. And I think to start, chocolate is something that, like you were saying, everybody has some sort of, a lot of people around the world have some sort of fascination with chocolate.
Right.
In connection with chocolate. What is it about chocolate that just gets people going?
Well, I think it goes back to that sense of how it affects our brains and how unusual it is. Chemically, it's considered one of the world's, maybe the world's most perfect food because it's 50% cocoa butter, which is a very difficult fat to absorb. So it's not harmful to the body. Well, I suppose if you drank it continuously or something. In fact, part of it is medical. It's medicinal and has been for 5,000 years. So it affects the brain because of the serotonin and the theobromine, the cocoa butter, and all the other minerals. And when the first Westerners, Mexico, Cortez, 1519, and then subsequently, were exposed to chocolate, they found what the Indians already knew, which was it was like it gave them energy and it was sensual. It has that component about it, the love drug, the serotonin, the feel-good aspect, which is clearly part of what goes into our minds. Flavanols, serotonin, there's serotonin in our minds normally, but it's nothing like what happened when they were first exposed to cacao. And that just boosted it all. So it took about 40, 50 years for the people to really get into it in Mesoamerica. We know, of course, it was...
And these are the Spanish that came over. And because like you're saying, a lot of the history around chocolate and cacao has kind of been Western oriented, right?
Yes, very much so. Practically all of it, particularly in the popular writing, because it's in the countries that make it and consume it. And that's primarily the United States. You've got Latin America, but the United States and Europe. And of course, now that's expanding, which is something else we can talk about, because that's a very important part of it. So
can we dive? So I'd love to kind of understand the roots of chocolate, because it feels like chocolate has really excited people in Europe and in the U.S. and it's blew up, right? But like, can we go way back to the beginning? Like, how was chocolate consumed in Mesoamerica 5,000 years ago, and why?
You're right about Mesoamerica. Even though it was discovered and first consumed not as chocolate, but as the pulp surrounding the beans in the upper Amazon regions of what is now Ecuador. And then over the years it moved, and in Mesoamerica they began to realize, perhaps accidentally, perhaps on purpose, that the seeds themselves would grow into a tree, and there's a lot of the trees are ancient. They go back millions and millions of years, probably to even the time it's been estimated when the continents separated. And it's a kind of evergreen tree, but that's another subject. But the pods grow on the trunk, and they're very attractive because of that pulp. The pulp itself makes a delicious drink.
It's like a citrus drink, right?
Exactly. And they still, in Central America, you can take the pulp and you can put it in alcohol and you can make a very nice drink. And then somebody figured out that the beans also would do something. So as these trial by errors go, it's like I've always wondered about how the devil we got from those hard olives that taste terribly bitter to olives we love. And it's probably another accident, tree falling in the ocean. But back to cacao. So they began to drink it and consume it. And this was pre-Olmec, which was about 3,000 years ago. And it became part of the spiritual side, a very important spiritual side for all the Mesoamericans. Not necessarily to the same degree, particularly it was in the Toltecs, the Mayans, and the Aztecs. For the Mayans, the cacao tree was the tree of life, the maize and the cacao. And so it becomes part of their religion and part of how they view themselves and part of how they deal with the gods, where it's grown, how it's used. The old ball courts of the Olmecs and others, the game was played and the winner was sacrificed. But a lot of this comes out of that, how we live and how we die. Cacao, to the Mayans and Aztecs, even had the shape, and others, the shape of the heart, the bean. And they would use añate and dye it a little to make it more red. So it was also connected to the blood.
But they would dye the bean,
yes,
to make it look like the heart.
And the chocolate as well that they were drinking. They would add this. And in marriage ceremonies, for example, the two couples in Maya's lands would exchange cacao seeds, pods, seeds, yes.
Okay.
It was that infusion of the bloodlines between the two families. So the Spanish abandoned all of that spiritual side. The sacrifices that the Aztecs did, the Toltecs and the Mayans, where they would sacrifice people and rip out the heart and so forth. But the Aztecs, for example, fed the prisoners who were going to be sacrificed, or someone else, a lot of chocolate. And as the drink, because remember, it was a drink and nothing else until almost 1900.
So I kind of want to dive into that a little bit.
Sure.
Why would they feed these prisoners the chocolate?
What they were doing then was transforming their hearts into cacao beans and into this symbiotic relationship with the gods.
Interesting. So cacao for thousands of years has kind of been this connection between, could you say, humans and the gods?
Yes.
The spirit
Definitely
world.
so. Very important. And even today in parts of Yucatan, they still have festivals connected with that, particularly in Yucatan, Belize, and so forth. So it hasn't gone away. The Day of the Dead, you've got cups of chocolate that are left on altars and things like this. And all of that's been modified. It's been studied a great deal. There's a lot of wonderful scholarship on this. But you look even on some of the Mayan carved monuments and you see in figures the cacao. In tombs you would find porcelain type or clay fired cacao beans. And you'd find tools in there. And they would keep these because it was very important to them to carry that with them.
Interesting.
Some of the Mayan kings called themselves Lord Cacao.
Wow. So this was like a critical piece of their culture.
Yes.
And so the Mayans and the Olmecs were drinking cacao for thousands of years and having it in their ceremonies. Right. And then you said the Spanish come over, discover the cacao. What did they do when
they were given chocolate to drink. And of course, the other part that we should touch on at least was, as a medicine, it was also extremely important.
Oh, yeah.
And also it was important to the women, both from the medical aspects and also the women who could make good chocolate. And the women and the Aztecs were the only ones who could pour and mix it. But if you were a slave, if you could make good chocolate, you might well be accelerated up into an upper level position, non-slave, because of how important it was.
Interesting, okay.
Now the Aztecs excluded women from drinking it. At least that was the official policy. For part of that may be that they lived in areas where cacao didn't grow. And one of the reasons the Aztecs expanded their empire as they did was they wanted to conquer these cacao areas because they knew how good it was, how important, and it was a currency to them. In fact, it continued to be a currency. It was not demonetized in Mexico until October of 1923.
Really? So cacao beans were still flying around as
money.
As money.
Right. And part of it was because The Spanish didn't necessarily like that idea, but they couldn't mint enough silver coins to compensate. And so the poor people depended upon it. In fact, you hear comments from an archbishop in Peru or other places saying that if it wasn't for the cacao bean, the poor people could not survive, because you could use them to buy tomatoes or turkeys or avocados or slaves or whatever. And this extended into the Caribbean into the 17th century as well. And it was also part of the trade routes into the southwestern United States. It was for a time in the 1800s pegged against the American dollar as well as against the Spanish real.
Is there any other fruit or bean like this around the world that has had this much, I guess, influence in a culture?
I can't think of one right off the top of my head. There's a number of them that have been used for money in different places and a number of different kinds of money. But from what I have read, it seems like this is the one that had the biggest impact that way. And was so central to them.
So then it was so central to their culture, and I mean, they really prized it and celebrated it.
Right.
Would you say that so like when the Spanish came over and then took the cacao and the chocolate over to Europe, was it still celebrated like that?
Not in the Spanish pretty well evaporated the spiritual part of it. They hung on to the medicinal and the sensual, sexual aspects, because they could see, and of course you see this story, which is apocryphal at least, because they talked about Montezuma drank out of golden goblets and then he'd throw them away. Well, the goblets were usually fine ceramic pieces. The Mayans, you will find, signed them. Some of them, it was just a particular art. Some of those specially crafted drinking goblets like that are found in the pueblos of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, the Canyonlands area. So people just esteemed it, and part of it was that energy aspect. They didn't know what we know today about the chemicals in it, but they knew how they felt. It's the first mind-altering substance that Westerners ever encountered. Chocolate drinks are the gateway drink to tea and coffee. And they contain little bits of caffeine. The theobromine is also a caffeine, but not the same as caffeine in coffee. And so it was those compounds, theobromine, serotonin. We are caffeine saturated. So we can't even begin to imagine the effect it had. Cortez said and noted how much energy it gave to the armies.
Interesting. So these chemicals that are in cacao do they actually have, does cacao actually have serotonin in it? Or is it just activating?
In the cacao seed.
Interesting. So there's serotonin, which is making us feel happy and
antidepressant, theobromine, and all these other, probably some 500 or more compounds, minerals, vitamins, and chemicals that, if you're separated, I remember one from reading a particular document that said, separated out, it smelled like rotten fish. But somehow it becomes an important component in this whole mix of a cacao seed.
What smells like rotten fish?
One of the components that goes into this whole mass. It gets separated out of it. Not all of that's been explored. They continue to explore it, but the FDA puts limits on what can be used. For example, one aspect of it is there's a tiny trace, I don't know how much, I'll just call it a tiny trace, of poison in there.
And so I've heard that theobromine is poisonous in high quantities.
Well, if for animals, certainly parrots, dogs, cats, all this chocolate, that'll kill them. So you want to keep them away. I think it's like anything. If you take too much of anything,
too much water,
reaction.
You're gonna drown yourself.
But it's this kind of thing that stimulated the brain to want more. And when we want more, you know what happens, then we start to salivate, whether it's whatever kind of food it is. They've also proven chemically that they can have tested it, that when you're gifted chocolate, you feel more disposed to like the person that gives it to you, which is how the courting rituals came about of men and women as well.
Which still goes on today.
Right. And so it gets modified as it goes along, and it's clearly not as it was in the late 19th century and in the early 20th. But yes, it's still considered a gift of some seriousness.
So the chocolate itself then, it's affecting our minds.
Yes.
Is it also affecting our hearts? Like so I've heard that theobromine kind of opens up or works on the cardiovascular system.
Yes.
Is that something that's going on too?
Oh yes, in fact, they've done tests for a long time. You know, we talked a little bit about what you should think about tests, and you always have to look at who's funding the test, because Mars and Hershey and some of the others who clearly have a vested interest in this, besides their other interests, you have to take those and think, well, how much weight should I give to something? Mars, for example, has a special high theobromine serotonin, I think it was cocovia, that they would use in tests.
Okay.
But they could never sell the product because for most people it wasn't sweet enough. But you can find a lot of tests, and these have been going on. The first printed test was actually done by a woman doctor in Spain about 1654, 55. And she commented on how it improved women's lactic ability and worked with the mind, and she didn't know exactly why, but she could tell by observation. Later on, a woman by the name of Deborah Whitehurst in the 1990s showed how chemicals affect women from chocolate different than they affect men, even though 56% of the American public says it's their favorite substance. So we're sort of wandering here a little bit. But
but it all makes sense. Like, it's whether we're a man or a woman or whoever we are, we're getting acted on. Whenever we drink chocolate, it's activating things in us.
Yes.
And we're feeling a certain way. Which,
Yeah, let me go back and correct myself. Olivia Barea, it was 1588 that was the first printed study of chocolate.
Okay.
And the men who were physicians poo-pooed everything she did.
Really?
Sounds like something, doesn't it, that we know about.
Seems to happen today still.
But yes, they do that. It does improve. They've tested it and continue to do this. Blood pressure, circulation, and sometimes it's a very simple amount that it takes to generate this.
So chocolate versus cacao. This is something that I see popping up a lot. And I know people are wondering, what's the main difference? Because you go to Whole Foods and you see cacao powder that's sitting in the superfood section, and then there's the cocoa powder, which is down in the baking aisle. What's the big difference there?
Well, in fact, if you look at spelling, the CAO at the end is before it becomes a product. The COA is after it becomes a product. So cacao is what chocolate comes from. That's the easiest way to do it. Whether it's cocoa powder, whether it's chocolate bars, whether it's bonbons, whatever it is that's a product, it all originates because of cacao, the seed, the bean. And it goes through different processes. And the process can also change what good things we get out of a bar or a drink or something.
I see. So things that are overly processed removes the nutrients.
Yes.
The nutrients out of the
Looking
cacao.
at cacao powder, cocoa powder, see, that's the difference. We can say one's one and one's the other. Dutch process looks better because it's darker. But it's alkalized so that it strips some of the flavonols. The flavonols are some of the good things that you get, which were really missing in Europe. The diet of Europe before they came to the New World could be very limited, particularly because of all the fast days.
Okay.
because that's another path
Sure.
to go.
Yeah.
But it strips out some of that. So when you have cocoa powder that's Dutch, it is not as healthful as natural cocoa powder,
Okay.
which is just
And natural cocoa powder, could you call that cacao powder?
cocoa powder is pretty much what they try to call it all.
Okay, because I see cacao powder in the stores. Is that
Well,
just marketing?
no, a lot of these terms have become so interchangeable. Cacao, cocoa. Cocoa powder really developed in the late 1800s. This is the first time that the drink had been changed, because for a long time it separated. The cacao butter would sort of float to the top and the rest of it would go to the bottom. That's why they mixed it the way they did. Then through various chemical processes and technical processes, you found out how to press practically all the cocoa butter out of that, just leaving a pod or a solid piece that then would be pulverized and turned into powder. The alkaline, the Dutch process, made it a little easier to mix with water, because that's the way the first drink was. It was water. It didn't really become milk, using milk in it, until, say, roughly 1650, right around in there.
Okay.
Sir Hans Sloane.
Yeah.
And that was the way that it was drunk then, after that.
Yeah.
But the bar as we know it, even though it was invented in England in 1847, did not become really popular until after World War I.
So they started putting it in bars because maybe it was easier to transport and, and eat?
Transport and eat, and they figured they'd put the cocoa butter back in and put it in molds, and they would sell it that way.
Yeah.
And that was pretty much what happened in Europe and the United States. And then you had the impact of World War I. Two of the biggest impacts on chocolate were World War I and World War II. Because it had always been used, chocolate, as an army ration, or by explorers, Lewis and Clark, Samuel Champlain. The Spaniards in the southwest of the United States would use it as wages, part of the wages for Comanches, who were their scouts. And if they captured Apaches and they put them in a hospital, which they did, they were given chocolate to drink because they knew it would make them stronger, faster.
And is it actually good? Is it good for you? So these explorers that are drinking it, the Mayans that were drinking it, the Spanish that were drinking it, they're getting it, their brains are changing, their internal chemistry is shifting, and are these things are good?
Yes.
That are fundamentally they're good.
Right. And that's why
sugar.
Cortez said, my gosh, with the drink, the chocolate, a man can go all day without having anything else to eat.
Wow, okay.
And the Aztec armies used chocolate balls, which is how they were assembled, and then they could break them down into a drink as part of their rations. And this went on for virtually almost every army after that. In World War II, the standard issue ration D, was a specially designed 600-calorie bar. Some of the cocoa butter was removed. But it was designed so that the GI could survive on nothing but those bars for 2 or 3 days.
Oh, wow.
And so, because it was packed with vitamins and minerals.
Yeah.
There was a special one developed for the Navy and a special one developed for the Army. And
okay.
desert warfare, they developed a special model there.
Special model of chocolate.
Right, they took out, you want to watch that melting, because it melts just below body temperature.
Okay.
And so what you wanted to do was, you can't have that happening in the field, or you'll just have...
Yeah, just mush.
Yeah, exactly.
Mush in your pocket.
And the one in Vietnam, according to friends of mine who served in Vietnam, was called the John Wayne bar.
Oh, wow.
Came in a circular can.
And would they just eat it just straight? Or
Right.
they would melt it, just kind of depends
However
on
they
the
wanted
situation.
to work with it. The early, like the Indians, would grind it into a drink, but this was designed just to do, like, if you were eating a Hershey bar in the field.
Interesting.
In World War I, it was Baker that supplied chocolate bars to the Army. But they were doing everything. In World War II, not only were they getting the ration bar, but they were eating vast amounts of candy bars, which is a particularly American institution. Between from the 20s to the 30s, there were 30,000 different kinds of candy bars in the United States.
Oh god. Candy bars meaning like chocolate candy bars?
Chocolate candy bars.
So let's break this down a little bit. Like, what is the main difference between pure cacao / chocolate and the chocolate candy bar that we see in Hershey's and Milky Way and Reese's?
Well, the point you make is very good, because there's chocolate candy, which a lot of people feel is chocolate. All it has is a thin covering on it, because the candy makers found that chocolate would help preserve the inside, whatever was in there, coconut, caramel, you name it. And it was easy. Plus it was, bulky, looked good.
Yeah.
And so people got that. But a lot of the GIs, and most of the GIs that went overseas in World War I had never had chocolate.
Pure chocolate.
Right, well, or any kind of chocolate.
Oh, okay.
Because think back, and you can, chocolate couldn't be transported easily. Hot weather, it would melt. So Baker's, for example, which was the first major American company, did not ship west of the Mississippi, because they also had, too hot. And they also had 100% guarantee. So by the time it got, it would probably be bad. Because initially they made it up, this was before Baker's, in big blocks. And you go into a pharmacist and you would chip off some. Or they
pharmacist.
Right.
For the medical benefits.
And also there weren't candy stores or anything then. So the pharmacy was the logical place to go.
So the pharmacy was the first candy shop.
Right. And so World War I, you had, I think it was about 7 million American soldiers mobilized, 5 to 7. And their ration came from Baker. Baker had also supplied Washington's army at Valley Forge for chocolate rations. So they came back from the war having a taste for chocolate. And then the market began to boom, and then the candy bars, which had really started before World War I, like Baby Ruth, that boomed because they were easy to carry, they were 5 cents, and you got an immediate burst of not chocolate, but sugar.
Yeah. And sugar is a really addictive thing, and sort of maybe like chocolate can be, but sugar is worse for you.
Sugar is much worse. Chocolate is actually the world's most craved food. And it contains all these vitamins and minerals and flavonols. If it's above 70%. The FDA requires labeling chocolate with percentage. If they don't label it, and you are seeing some in the United States from abroad that's not labeled, you know it's probably under 50%.
Okay.
So that means if you were to buy let's say a Hershey's milk chocolate bar, which most people are familiar with, and that became a standard in World War II. That has 1/10 of an ounce of chocolate in it. That's the minimum the FDA says you can have. Our rules are different than the EU. So basically everything else in there is powdered milk, is an oil of some kind, maybe some cocoa butter, palm oil, whatever, and then sugar. In a 70% bar, 70% of that will be some part of chocolate. Cocoa butter, cocoa solids, comes in various names, cocoa mass, cocoa liquor, chocolate liquor. And then the rest of it, except for maybe a tiny bit of vanilla or lecithin, which is an emulsifier, is sugar. Excuse me. So the higher you go percentage-wise, the healthier it is for you.
And that's where we see like the cacao nibs, and we see like this more pure chocolate that people are putting in smoothies and different bowls of sorts, because it is healthy.
Right.
It is good for you.
See, and
oh no, go ahead.
The cacao nib is the last product before it is ground into chocolate. So when you find those in the store, and you do, health food stores and everything else, because that's probably the purest antioxidant you can find. The antioxidant ingredients in chocolate, as measured by various government standards, are 5 times higher than the next highest, blueberries, fruits like that.
Oh wow. So that's the highest antioxidant.
Right. Would be to take the nibs, and a lot of people do, and they grind them, they put them on cereal in the morning, or as you say, in smoothies or whatever, and use that. Of course, the other alternative is you get a good 100% bar, and then you mix it up. I still like to do a hot chocolate, which is from a bar or chunks, as opposed to a hot cocoa, which is from cocoa butter.
And that's because the chocolate still has, it's less processed, more pure, has the nutritional benefits in it, as opposed to that powder.
They both have nutritional benefits. Natural cocoa powder is very good.
Yeah.
It has far more than Dutch process. So that's a good way to get the grams that you need for flavanols and things. But a lot of people like the processed bar to use, and then they'll add milk. You can still do it with water.
So yeah, what's your kind of go-to? How do you make your hot chocolate?
I'll go both ways.
Do you put anything else in it, or just chocolate and milk?
Chocolate and milk, or you can use chocolate and water. Then if you want to, you can sweeten it with honey.
Okay. Yeah.
So instead of regular sugar, you can use cane sugar, which is used in the better chocolate bars, not refined sugar.
Yeah. You know what I've been seeing a lot is coconut sugar.
It gives it a different flavor.
Okay.
I've tried it, and there are bars that are made using coconut sugar.
Okay.
But it's different.
Yeah.
Just like the bars that use cocoa powder. And you'll see that on the back, because that's why anybody buying a bar should read the wrapper, read the back of the wrapper. If it says sugar first, it's candy.
It's not good.
Not good. It should have, well, maybe 2 or 3. The best sometimes only have 2 ingredients, the chocolate and cane sugar or something like that. But you read that and you know what's in there. If you see cocoa powder, there's nothing wrong with that, because that's a taste thing. For me, I don't like the alkaline taste of it as much as a regular chocolate. But to a lot of people that doesn't matter. Yeah. It also, for the manufacturer, usually makes the bar cheaper to make, so they make more in the bar.
Gotcha.
And you'll find that all over.
So I want to go into your journey with chocolate, because you're kind of you're seasoned in history and art history and Latin American history, and you've traveled all over the world. You've shown me all these different kind of artifacts that you have, and all the things you've experimented with, photography and dancing and then chocolate. How can you bring us along your journey of how you got into chocolate and have become the chocolate guru?
Well, it started really as most people's does, as a kid. And my mother's family was from Wisconsin. They had a dairy farm. My grandmother had a wood stove that she kept just for baking. And I guess I was the favorite grandchild, because when I was around, I usually got the first biscuits or whatever came out. And she would always put, what I'm sure was either Baker's or Hershey's piece in there for me. The other thing she did, which was very French, was sometimes she would then toast in the oven. She put a little bit maybe of butter on the toast, but she always had some chocolate that was grated or thinly sliced, and she'd let that start to melt. Yeah. And that's great in the morning, or as the French do often, in the afternoon.
Yeah, so I've seen the French, they put Nutella on, but this is like...
This is just a regular bar. Yeah, Nutella is a sugar bomb.
Yeah.
I mean, it tastes good, but it's a sugar bomb.
It is. This tastes good, and it's better for you.
Better for you. If you go to the better chocolate.
Yeah. So she would spread the chocolate on the toast, and that just sold you.
It would melt a little bit, and I'd have that. Then I got into it. I got into foods and food culture.
Mm.
I started cooking for schoolmates when I was in high school. I'd have dinner parties, but I'd always have something chocolate there. Either I would make or I would bring in something.
Mm.
And in my professional life, then I kept up my interest in cooking because from the 1960s on, a lot changed in the United States. World War II made us the world's greatest power. And with the money we had, we began to travel. And so we started finally, with World's Fairs and other things, bringing in Belgian waffles, kiwis. 1960 saw the beginning of the production of the Time Life foods of the world. 1962, you had Julia Child. Same time, you had Silent Spring, which was the first and a huge book about poisons and sprays that were put on our food products. So it was about that time, when I was growing up and getting into this and cooking more and taking new lessons and baking. And it was all part of this growing awareness in the United States, along with the impact of various women's liberation movements, and getting away from courting with chocolate and letting women make their own choices. So people began to say, well, what am I getting my food products from? What is processing doing to it? And that was part of the whole movement where we went to better food, natural foods. The French had started with artisanal bars in the late 40s, but they didn't really get into that until the 80s and 90s when they came up with the concept of terroir, like how wine is affected by the soil and the climate. Cacao is the same way. Cacao that grows closer to the equator doesn't have as much cacao butter by small percentages as cacao that's growing further away because it's warmer. So there's all these subtleties, and if you look at some of the wonderful books that have been written on bean to bar chocolate and artisanal chocolate that have come out in the last 10, 15, more than that, 25 years on chocolate and all of this, and there's been a lot of them. Then you find out how, as we go along, how the bean grown in Madagascar will taste differently from a bean grown in Hawaii. It's also part of the process of how the maker ferments it and roasts it. And it's just a fabulous,
so many different factors.
Complex factor, yes.
So that just kind of drew you in, the complexity of this, this food.
And then I got to teach a food and culture course. And that took me back into Caribbean food because it was centered around that. And then as I went along, I just kept getting further and further into it. And when I went into semi-retirement by moving to Hawaii, I met some wonderful cacao growers and cacao makers, some of the really fine things that were happening and are still happening in Hawaii. And then I came back to the United States and was able to become a reader at the Huntington so I could carry on my research, and began to teach at UCLA on the economic science and history of chocolate. And I do public talks and academic papers and,
So it started as just an interest in the taste.
Yes.
Has kind of become this interest in the cultural aspect of it, the nutritional aspect of it, and now it's like you're educating people on what this does. And cacao, it seems like it's more than just a food. It's kind of become this like icon for many different things, whether it's for connection or for love or for happiness. Like, are these things that you like in your course? Are these things that you touch on and kind of
you have to, because they've got to understand why the mind likes it and what the effect is, and how it imprints from childhood on for a lot of people, whatever kind of chocolate it is. Because a lot of people still think it's chocolate candy, and that's what they're interested in, when they should be interested in chocolate itself, the better kinds.
The food,
because that's what makes it healthier for you. And they have shown that It only takes small amounts of chocolate in tests to increase blood circulation. They've begun to test on people with dementia, have for a long time. I shouldn't say begun, that means it sounds like it's very recent. But with the sense of it brings back memories, good memories of childhood, and they've tasted it before. It's up here in your brain, so you just stimulate it. The other thing I think attracted me, and is like most people, is how it feels in the mouth. That full, creamy mouth, or partial, or that luxurious taste on the receptors on your tongue. They've never been able to replicate that. And
in any other food.
Right, and in any kind of trying to experiment with chocolate. Chocolate substitutes. It just isn't the same. And all the bars, that's the fun part about exploring all these bars that are made everywhere in the world. And how they do it. And how it tastes, and what they put in it. Like tea, different kinds of tea. In Taiwan, you can buy a bar with dried shrimp in it.
Shrimp in the chocolate?
Yes.
Okay, whatever floats their boat.
Well, that's right. It's all regional. It's like, you'll hear people say that the Cadbury egg doesn't taste as good made by Hershey as it did made by Cadbury.
Sure, because they know they have the magic touch. What is that? Is it a certain ingredient, or
it's the conching that the British did.
Okay.
To speed up the conching, they heated it, so it has a slight caramelize to it.
Okay.
Hershey doesn't do that.
Yeah.
And Hershey bought all of Cadbury's North American properties years ago.
Oh, really? Huh.
So, but now you see a lot of Cadbury out because the big companies that own these products want to use the old labels on them.
I see.
Because Cadbury was bought out many years ago for about $8.9 billion, I think it was.
Crazy. So going into the different chocolates that are around the world, the shrimp chocolate in Taiwan, whatever else,
tea chocolate.
Right. Is there like a through line between all of them? Like, is there something that all of these different chocolates have? I mean, of course, they're all made with chocolate,
right? But
I don't know, just in your experience dealing with these, like a certain process that's always the same for the best chocolate. Is there any through line?
Well,
all the different
it
chocolates?
really depends upon the maker.
Okay.
Most of them try to make it creamy smooth, and that's able to do that with conching and melanging and various things. But not all of them. There is that what's called rustic, so you get a little more texturizing. A lot of this depends on the individual, either the country taste or the maker, as to what they're going to put in it. I'll be using some Hawaiian chocolates in my next class at UCLA this next month. And some of the passion fruit and other things that are used there are very Hawaiian, but they go wonderfully with chocolate. So it's, where am I and what can I use here? I just tasted one from Hong Kong, which was a goji berry and osmanthus. Goji berries are very high in antioxidants.
Yeah.
But there the maker is saying, well, I want to try these things and see how they go.
So they're just experimenting.
Right, experimenting. They know they're local. They want to put a better antioxidant, or they want to give maybe a tea taste, or they want to make blueberries, or they want to smoke the chocolate a little bit over apple wood or something like that, or they want to use beer in it, or it's just all over the place.
Yeah, so it's almost an infinite number of things you could do with chocolate.
Right.
And I guess I feel like there's a lot of other foods that are kind of being experimented with like that. But what I think is really interesting about chocolate is that it does kind of have there's this notion that it does connect people, whether it's through love or just through all these chemicals that are in it.
Pleasure I get out of the taste and the smell and the satisfaction chemically of feeling better because of it.
Yeah.
It's all an important part of it.
Yeah, so I want to dive into this idea of connection and how chocolate might facilitate that. So, for example, the coffee, the chocolate houses in Europe seems like another example of that sort of bringing people together.
Mhm.
Do you have any experiences, or have you studied the chocolate coffee houses and how?
Well, it's very interesting what
Come about.
happened with that because, you know, for a long time, chocolate in Europe was the province of only the rich because there were high tariffs and taxes that the crown wanted, or the king, whoever, for the use of the government. So in France, they would have this at salons or in the middle of the night or the morning. And to the English, this all looked very decadent. And in fact, chocolate became sort of considered around 1800, a little before, yeah, probably quite a bit before, sort of the Catholic drink, because it went from Spain to France, and it was introduced into France not by Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, who did bring chocolate into it, but Cardinal Richelieu's brother, a doctor, knew that Cardinal Richelieu had flatulence, regular, lots of it, and so he understood from the tests and from what the Mesoamericans knew, which had been passed on, that chocolate was good for flatulence, among other things.
Okay.
So Richelieu
All right.
would travel, as many of the French aristocrats did, with their own chocolate makers.
Okay.
And later, Charles Dickens would write A Tale of Two Cities, and in there he would, in about 2 pages of description of the main villain, who had 3 people, all with gold watches, to make his own chocolate, and was the uncle of Charles Darnay. But that mold was applied to the French. The English didn't get into it right away. When English pirates would capture Spanish ships and they'd find the cacao aboard, they apparently thought it was sheep's droppings and dumped it overboard. But the first chocolate house opened in England in 1647.
Okay. Was that the first one in Europe?
No, there were others, but
Okay.
the first one in England, which was a major thing, because the English took it differently than did the French or the Germans. All had their little variations on it. Chocolate houses were part of it. In the Austro-German area, you had chocolate houses, and a lot of wonderful stories comes out of there. But again, a lot of it on the continent was restricted to wealthy until later, when you got companies that were making more. So you had the chocolate houses, and the chocolate houses in England, and particularly in London, became associated, some of them, with political parties. And Charles II tried to ban them because they were used for political purposes. Under later kings and queens, they came back. And then they began to integrate with coffee houses. So you get both. And of course, Hogarth in Rake's Progress makes much of one of these chocolate coffee houses. So chocolate becomes, as it moves into Europe, and we need to talk about Latin America a little too, and the Caribbean, because people forget about those places.
Well, and that's where it kind of comes from.
Right, and it goes into the arts. So you get Spanish tiles, you get paintings with chocolate implements, you get music. One of my quiz questions for some of my students is, tell me a Mozart opera that features chocolate. And that's Così fan tutti.
Okay.
But you carries through, it goes into movies, continues to the present day, it sort of saturates everything. So the coffee house became a very important center for people to get together. Later in England, the women didn't like the fact having men having chocolate houses. And initially they said, well, chocolate and coffee sort of, we got to get rid of that. But it became a favorite of the temperaments people, because then they could convert people from alcohol. So it weaves in and out of these different cultures.
Interesting.
And
it all, like you said, kind of stems from the Caribbean and South America. Let's dive into that a little bit. How cacao is sort of still living and breathing and expanding in those regions. What's going on down
well,
there?
what happens is, of course, for many, many years, into the 1700s, at least, the Caribbean and Mesoamerica, Central America, that area, and later Venezuela, and then these other countries, were centers for most of the production of chocolate in the world. But chocolate or cacao is very susceptible to disease. And the Spanish eventually wiped out in Central America most of the crops because they moved the Indians off their small farms and brought in cattle and things like this, and then you had disease coming in. But the Spanish spread it to the Caribbean, planted it in Jamaica and Trinidad, and it was already in Venezuela and these areas in the Upper Amazon. In the Upper Amazon areas of Brazil, it was the Jesuits who then began to control the wild cacao and work with that. Brazil, though, unlike the rest of Latin America, was never big on chocolate. They were more tea-oriented because it was a Portuguese colony. Although the industry in Brazil was very important until the late 1900s, about 1980, when witch's brew and some of these other diseases wiped it out. Now it's come back. But the Spanish actually took chocolate with them into South America. Because remember, it had originated...
So they took it out of South America and then...
No, they took it out of Central America, spread it into what we call Latin America today. They spread it to their colonies because chocolate was only chocolate in Central America, Mexico, even though it had originated in the upper Amazon regions of Ecuador. So they took it with them. The monks were the ones, and nuns, and then some merchants who were responsible for taking it into Europe and into South America, but it became part of the local. So you had particular customs, like in a couple of the countries, Colombia and particular, some in Ecuador, they like to dip cheese in chocolate, things like this. A lot of those continue.
Or like in Spain with the churros, right? They dip the churros in the chocolate.
Yes, so that went there. So everybody just sort of shifts a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much the way it goes on. And then chocolate, as it expands and becomes cheaper, that's one of the keys. That only happens in the late 1800s again, because then you have large manufacturers and tariffs drop and laborers get paid more money, and so for a day or two wages they can buy chocolate, whereas even a couple of years before that they had to work weeks to get that to buy it. So it booms in that period. And then the World War I, World War II expands.
So where are we today with chocolate?
Well, today it's more ubiquitous than it's ever been.
Because I see craft chocolate becoming huge.
Yes.
And it, like we've talked about, there's chocolate in the superfood section of the stores, and there's $15 chocolate bars popping up. You know, like I think it's masked chocolate. They have these really fancy, beautifully designed packages, and it just seems like the craft chocolate is starting to boom.
Well, there's a lot of good craft chocolates, like in California too. You've got many in Southern California, Northern California. There's something I think in excess of maybe, and I don't have the exact number, but certainly in 200 to 300 craft chocolate makers in the United States. It's probably the largest craft making group, and may be corrected on that, which is just fine for me. I'd like to know exactly how many there are. There are almost that many now, according to the last world tasting competitions in Europe.
Okay.
And huge populations in Asia as well. You're getting it in Singapore, in Taiwan, Japan. Japan went into chocolate early in the 1900s, and that boomed too after World War II. But you've got special holidays that came out of Japan. You've got cacao growing practically everywhere in Southeast Asia and India. And it was actually introduced there many years ago. The Portuguese supposedly brought some seedlings into India and Goa and into Bali and places, Indonesia, early. We know that the first seedlings to go to the Philippines from Mexico was 1670. It may have gone as early as 1640, but there are documents showing who took it there.
These are the first seedlings to go to where, you said?
Go to the Philippines from Mexico.
I see.
And that's the way it has to transfer, because a seed will die within 10 days. So you've got to have seedlings to move them around. But it spread, but it didn't catch on in Southeast Asia, even though they tried it repeatedly there. Began in the 1831, I think it was first in Hawaii. And, but it just tried to renew it again in the late 1800s, didn't catch on. In 1900, chocolate production shifted, as it is still today, predominantly to Africa. But in the late 1900s and into the 21st century, not only has Asia emerged as one of the larger growing markets, but it's also very, very important in cacao growing.
Okay. And the chocolate that's here in Los Angeles or Southern California, you mentioned to me on the phone the other day that we're kind of in a chocolate desert. Is that literally, what do you mean by that?
I mean, there are not a lot of outlets that have a huge variety of chocolate to sell. The biggest one I know is on Sir Marcel's in the old original farmers market in Los Angeles, down on Fairfax. There are others, and I can't name them all, but it's not like if you go to San Francisco and you go to chocolate covered. Jack has 1,200 varieties of chocolate there.
Oh my God.
I haven't seen anything like that in Southern California.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. As far as being a chocolate desert, that's what I'm referring to.
I see.
As far as the makers go, we have as many makers as probably more than other parts of the state, but they're scattered all in small towns, big cities, the West Coast. I think Portland has at least 12.
Okay.
Seattle, just plethora of them.
Okay. And would you say it's growing?
No, it's made there. You can't.
I mean the industry.
Almost definitely.
It's growing, expanding. People want it.
From it started, the Scharfenbergers in 1996 in Berkeley were probably the first major well-known chocolate maker in California. And a lot of it came out of that, and then you began to get more, and then it really took off in the in the 21st century.
So what's the future of chocolate?
Well, people say, oh my God, climate change is going to destroy it. No, it'll shift it. Chocolate grows only 20 degrees above and below the equator because it doesn't like too much heat, doesn't like too much water. Too much wind is not good for the tree because the pods are growing basically on the trunk. So it's a very fussy and promiscuous plant. But that's going to shift. It's already affected Africa because Africa is now working on hybrids instead of their mass market. They're mostly the cacao that goes into the big manufacturers. Hershey's, the Lindt, all of those, Nestle. And that's the least flavorful of all of the cacao beans. And they've practically, in Ghana, for example, Ivory Coast, there's areas where they denuded the rainforests. But they can see it's shifting, because with wines, southern Britain now grows champagne grapes.
Really? Okay. So it's almost like things are becoming, I guess, it's almost like we can grow anything anywhere.
Well, that's
today.
because the heat is shifting.
Oh, gotcha. I see.
The growing seasons are changing. I mean, that was noticed many years ago here by tree growers in Southern California. Blossoming earlier, this kind of thing. So it'll shift, but it will be, according to what I've read, in 6 years, by 2026, almost $190 billion business worldwide. That includes every aspect of it, from the plants to the selling to the 55 million or so who work at some aspect of it.
Mm.
So it's not an economy that people are going to give up.
Yeah.
A number of the countries around the world that grow it, particularly in Africa, it's their major export.
Mm.
And they're very dependent upon it.
I see. And I'm sure it provides a lot of jobs. There's a lot of people working on these farms that are growing these cacao.
Farms and the 55 million people worldwide, some connected with the business.
Mm. Wow.
Most 90% or more of cacao, is grown up by smallholders, which is defined as having maybe 1 to 5 hectares of land. And a hectare is about 2.5 acres.
Okay. Mm.
There are some cases of larger, 100-acre and so forth. In some countries, it's easier to make a larger plantation, if you want to call it that.
Mm.
Although the larger growing areas have never worked as well as the small holders, which is why there's still about 90% of the cacao grown.
Mm. So they can just take better care of the plants.
Yeah, and
the
you know
process
that's
and
still a good deal of land, but the plant itself has to be treated right.
Mm-hmm.
It's susceptible, as we said, to lots of diseases. In many areas, it has to be shaded because otherwise the heat and the effect on the soil, it won't work, it won't grow.
Mm.
Some areas you don't need it shaded, but other areas you do. So there's a lot of different factors going into the size of these.
I see. Interesting. So we're kind of running up on time, here. I'm curious, what is your favorite thing to do with chocolate? Like, what is your favorite thing to make with chocolate? Because you were saying how you bake a lot of things and you host these dinner parties. Do you have like a go-to specialty?
Well, you know, you can do so many things with it. I do a lot of baking. However, when I make chili or make some stews or some dishes, I will use a couple blocks of unsweetened chocolate to give it more depth, which is very common. You know, you look at a mole from Mexico, and some of those moles has as many as 36 different ingredients. So a brownie recipe I have uses chocolate stout, chocolate coffee stout to help give it a flavor to it. So I'd say I mostly lean to baking and to making different desserts. My favorite that I experiment on and have for years is my chocolate mousse.
Okay.
It's very rich.
And that's like a thick, like a fudge sort of thing?
It's not that thick, but it's much more cakey the way I make it.
Oh, I see.
Not quite that way, but it's not that creamy, easy to pour stuff that you get at a restaurant.
I see. Man, that sounds so tasty.
And then I usually flavor that with Grand Marnier.
Mm.
So.
Like you're saying, you use rum and some of in your vanilla that you
Right.
put in the chocolate.
Right, I make my own vanilla, and I experiment like you do with chocolate drinks.
Yeah.
I had one not too long ago where I put cacao nibs in with rum and let it stew a while, and you start taking that and making a basis for drinks.
Okay. Mm.
So there's a lot of things you can do with it, but my focus is more towards that baking dessert and baking bread, baking whatever type thing.
Mm. And when you're not dealing with chocolate, teaching chocolate, what is how do you spend your time? What else are you
Trying to get a lot of exercise.
Okay.
I also like to paint, and I like photography.
Mm.
And I love movies. Always have.
Yeah. Yeah, I could tell with all the pictures and all these incredible artifacts that you have. You really do have the sort of artistic touch.
Well, it's fun because there's so many things to deal with in the world. So many wonderful things you can learn.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time reading different things.
What
More
book are
the
you
better.
reading right now?
Well, I've got a lot of course, chocolate books, but I read everything from different histories of the Mughal Empire or texts on Shakespeare or Buddhism. I love murder mysteries set in the ancient world.
Wow, the ancient world.
Yes.
Ancient world murder mysteries.
Yes, I love
Like
those.
Atlantis?
There's a lot of ancient Rome or.
Okay.
You know,
Okay.
that's another one of my interest areas.
What is?
Ancient Rome.
Ancient Rome.
Right.
Hmm.
Fascinated me just from when I was a kid.
Okay. I feel like there's so much there's so many different rabbit holes we could go down.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
There really is. Well, I just want to say thank you for touching on all these kind of core aspects of cacao versus chocolate and how it's affecting cultures around the world and how we're all eating and drinking it and coming together around it. It
Well,
seems like there's just so much love around it.
Well, I'd like to also remind people that other than what I've said, which is just a bare bones introduction, because like my 10-week course at UCLA covers 5,000 years, but to look themselves on the internet for pieces on chocolate, look at books like Bean to Bar Chocolate. You've got you know, histories of chocolate. Again, a lot of them written from the Western aspect. A lot of recipe books included. They'll get into how to use different things and why they use a particular chocolate and where that chocolate comes from and why they pick that chocolate. So there's all kinds of places they can go.
So many factors, yeah.
That's
So
right.
many things to do with chocolate.
Best thing though is to learn how to eat the healthy, better chocolates. Get away from the sugar and into the 70% and up.
I see. 70%, 80%, 100%.
100%.
It's available.
Yes, because a candy bar, for example, Mars bar, or some of the others could have at least 29 grams of sugar in it.
Oh, that's not good. That is a killer. What did you call white sugar earlier?
White sugar has been called the white death.
The white death. Let's stay away from the white death.
Sugar people won't like me to say that, but it's a matter of historical record.
Well, sugar people aren't in it for people.
Well, in the 20s, for example, and I know you've got to go, but the sugar industry got taken on by the cigarette industry. Because the cigarette industry was saying, a cigarette's better for you than sugar. So sugar tried to develop a program saying, sugar is food.
I see.
If you eat sugar, you've done well today.
Yeah.
So advertising tells you a lot about what's going on.
Yeah.
They even put sugar in cigarettes for a long time. And then, you know, kids in the 50s were encouraged to have chocolate cigarettes, loaded with sugar, of course, just like dads.
So they looked like cigars, but they
little cigarettes, actually.
Oh, they were actually had tobacco.
And they, no, I mean, they were shaped the same way.
Oh.
And even came in a box like that. And
I've seen like the marshmallow ones, but yeah, never chocolate.
Right,
chocolate
and they
ones.
used to put chocolate in cigarettes. The British banned it first.
Just for flavor?
Flavor and also to get you to come back to it.
Oh.
Chocolate, you know, your brain saying, "Oh, it's got chocolate in it. I like that."
Again, so many different areas that chocolate's getting its way into.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and where can people, I guess, what's next for you? What can people look forward to kind of coming out of the Chocolate Guru, out of your Instagram, out of your work, out of your teachings?
Well, I'm working on a book, of course, and that will hopefully happen sometime this year, at least a finished first or second draft. I'm also working on organizing a chocolate festival and still going out and giving papers and talking to groups. I love to talk to everything from Sierra clubs to senior centers to DASs, whatever, because the chocolate story is good. Everybody knows they like chocolate, but they don't know much about it.
About the real stuff.
The real stuff, and about what's bad for you.
Yeah. All right. Well, they can find you at Chocolate Guru, at Chocolate Guru.
At
on
chocolate_guru.
Okay.
And send me questions.
All right. Let's keep the conversation going.
Good.
All right. Perfect. Thank you, Lee.
My pleasure.